my mother took a devastating secret to her grave. I had a twin sister she gave up for adoption right after we were born. From the moment I learned this, my life completely changed. Who was Eloise, the sister I never knew existed? And why did our mother choose to keep me and abandon her? Determined to find her, I embarked on a journey full of painful discoveries, confrontations, and deeply buried resentment. When I finally found her, Eloise was consumed by anger. She grew up feeling rejected, always sensing something was wrong, but never knowing I existed. How can I explain to her that I was also a victim of this secret? How can I ask her to accept me as her brother after so many years of silence and pain? And will she be able to forgive our mother, who even after death continues to haunt every one of our decisions? What started as a simple search for answers turned into something much bigger. The reunion of two lives separated by fate and a journey towards forgiveness. But can Eloise find it in her heart to forgive and move forward? And more importantly, after everything, will we be able to reconnect and finally become a true family? The path to forgiveness is long, and the ending, unexpected. The hospital room seemed colder with each passing second, or maybe it was just my mind, unable to process what was happening. The beeping of the monitors, which once reassured me, now caused a suffocating anxiety. My mother, Olivia's face was pale, her eyes fixed on the ceiling as if she were trying to find some comfort that she knew wouldn't come. Nathan. Her voice was weak, but I knew that what came next wouldn't be good. I leaned over the bed, trying to hear better, but my heart was beating so hard that it almost drowned out the sound. There's something you need to know before I go. The silence that followed was overwhelming. For a moment, I wished she wouldn't continue, that she would keep whatever it was to herself. But she pressed on, the pause feeling like it lasted an eternity. You have a sister, a twin. Those words hit my mind like a lightning bolt. I was completely paralyzed. A sister? A twin? How is that even possible? I stepped back a little, trying to process. I had always been an only child, right? My whole life had been just me and her, the two of us against the world. But she didn't stop. I gave her up for adoption. The pain and guilt in her voice were evident. For a moment, I didn't know what to think. My mother, the woman I had always admired, had kept this secret for 34 years? I looked at her, unsure of what to say. The words were stuck in my throat. My entire life. Had it been a lie? I couldn't take care of both of you. Her words hung in the air, heavy. Eloise was given to another family. I tried to process what she was saying, but it felt like my head was spinning. Everything was blurry. Eloise. The name echoed in my mind, but it felt strange, distant. I had a sister, a twin, and I had never known. My mother was crying, and I, so confused, felt my own tears forming. Why didn't you ever tell me? I asked. My voice choked, my throat tight. Deception and anger battled within me, and I knew I was about to lose control. She looked away for a moment, perhaps unable to face me. I was afraid of losing you too, she whispered, as if admitting to a terrible crime. I was so scared. Those words, even more than the confession about Eloise, hit me like a blow. She had kept this from me out of fear? Fear of losing me when she had already lost so much. It made sense, but at the same time, nothing made sense. The feeling of betrayal suffocated me, and I could hardly breathe. The silence in the room grew heavier until, slowly, I felt her hand slip from mine. I looked at her, knowing this was the end. She had left. And all that was left were questions and the certainty that, with her death, a part of my world was crumbling. I stood there, frozen beside my mother's bed, still holding her lifeless hand, as if somehow holding on could bring the answers she never managed to give me. I was in absolute shock. My mind was flooded with questions that would now never be answered by her. How could you hide something like this from someone for so long? How did I live 34 years without knowing about Eloise? And more importantly, how could I ever forgive her for this? My head throbbed with the impact of the revelation. My mother, the woman who raised me alone, who was my safe harbor, had left a twin sister behind. I looked around the room, searching for some anchor, something to help me process the whirlwind of emotions overwhelming me. But everything felt confusing, chaotic. I was lost. Eloise. Her name repeated in my mind. Who was this woman I had never met? Would she know about me? Would she know she had been given away? That I was chosen and she wasn't? My stomach churned just thinking about what she might have felt if she discovered it, or what she might think of me if she knew. How does someone approach a sister they never knew they had? More so, how does someone get close to a person who, in a way, seems to be the mirror of their own existence? I looked at my mother's lifeless body. The pain in my chest was unbearable, but the confusion, the feeling of betrayal was worse. She had left me with this heavy revelation without giving me the answers I needed. All I had was a name, Eloise. And now, a new emptiness I didn't know how to fill. My life had changed forever, and I knew that somehow I would need to find Eloise. But how? How do you search for someone you've never seen, but is, in a way, part of you? A whirlwind of emotions mixed together. Anger, sadness, confusion. And above all, a feeling of emptiness I had never felt before. I didn't know where to start, but one thing was certain. Eloise was now a part of me, and I needed to find her. It had been days of silence after the funeral. I avoided going back to my mother's house, but I knew I had to deal with what she had left behind, physically and emotionally. The house was empty, cold in a way I had never felt before. Every room seemed to carry the weight of secrets that I now needed to unearth. I went up to the attic, a place we rarely visited. It was where my mother kept everything she didn't want to face. Among dusty boxes and furniture covered with cloth, I came across a small, dark wooden box. Something about it caught my attention, as if it had been waiting for me. With trembling hands, I opened the box, and there was a letter addressed to me in the handwriting I knew so well. My heart raced in my chest, and for a moment, I hesitated, as if opening that letter could bring more painful revelations than I was prepared to face. But I knew I needed to know. I unfolded the paper carefully. Olivia's words, my mother, whom I thought I knew completely, were there filled with guilt. "Nathan," she began, "if you are reading this, it's because you already know about Eloise." My heart tightened. She explained how, when she had me, she was alone, lost, without support. She felt she could not care for two babies. I did what I thought was right at the time, but I have regretted it every day since then. She wrote about regret, the fear that if I knew, I would distance myself from her. Each line overflowed with pain. I was never strong enough to face this mistake. Forgive me, my son. The tears I had been holding back since the funeral finally fell. The woman I thought was my strength, the only constant in my life, had kept a secret that was destroying me. It was as if, in that moment, I was reading a letter from a stranger. I sat on the attic floor, the letter still in my hands, as the words echoed in my head. I did what I thought was right. Those words haunted me. How could she think that abandoning my sister was the right thing? Eloise, my twin, had been left behind, and I never knew. Was my entire childhood a lie? I raised my head, looking around as if everything in that house was now betraying me. The familiar smell, the photos on the walls, even the little memories we kept, all seemed false, built on top of a story that was never complete. My hands shook as I held the letter. She had written about regret, about the guilt that consumed her. But that didn't change the fact that she hid this from me my whole life. How did I never know? I murmured, feeling my voice falter. My head was spinning. I mentally replayed the moments we had together, searching for signs, for anything that could have alerted me. Nothing. There was nothing that revealed this hidden truth. Was I the chosen son? Or the son who was left? Doubt began to gnaw at the image I had of myself, of my mother, of my life. Who was I, after all, if the foundation of my story was built on such a devastating omission? I got up from the floor, the letter still open in my hands. The attic, which once seemed just another room, was now a tomb of secrets. I felt suffocated by the revelation, as if the house, which once was my home, was trying to expel me with the weight of lies. As I descended the stairs, the silence of the house seemed to echo my own doubts. With each step I took, I moved away from the life I knew. What was left now? Eloise. I knew I had to find her, no matter what it took. It was impossible to continue without knowing who she was, where she was, and how she lived. If she knew about me, if she had forgiven me, even without knowing me. I returned to the letter, searching for more clues. My mother mentioned the name of the orphanage where Eloise had been left. She had been given to a family called Everett. The name reverberated in my mind. Who were they? Did they give Eloise the life my mother thought she couldn't provide? I had so many questions and no answers, but as difficult as it was, I knew I couldn't stop. The search for Eloise was my only way out of this emotional labyrinth. I turned on the computer and began searching for information about adoption, about records, trying to find a starting point. My mind was focused on one thing: filling the void my mother left. The truth about Eloise was now all that mattered, but something deep inside troubled me. What if she didn't want to know me? What if Eloise had known about me all this time and rejected me? The thought terrified me, but it wasn't enough to stop me. I had to find her. Even if it meant facing even more painful truths, Eloise existed. And somehow, she had always been by my side, even if invisibly. The search for my sister wouldn't be easy, but I knew I couldn't go on without her. After much research, I finally found the orphanage. It was a place that exuded the past. Upon arrival, I was confronted with an old, decaying building, its walls covered in moss and dusty windows that no longer reflected light. It felt like a forgotten place, as if the secrets it harbored were also destined for oblivion. A cold wind blew, and I wondered how many lives had been impacted here, how many stories lost, just like Eloise's. Each step I took towards the entrance felt heavy. I felt as if I were walking towards the unknown, into a piece of my life I never knew existed. When I entered, the strong smell of mold and aged wood hit me. The lobby was dark, filled with old furniture and an atmosphere that seemed frozen in time. An elderly staff member, dusting a shelf of dusty papers, looked at me with curiosity. I approached and asked for Helen, a woman my mother had mentioned in her letter. "She has worked here for a long time," they said. A few minutes later, a woman with a wrinkled face and distant gaze appeared. Her eyes wandered over me for a moment before she asked what I wanted. "I am Olivia's child," I said, not knowing the impact this would have. For a moment, Helen seemed unable to believe it. Her eyes widened, and she brought her hand to her mouth. "Olivia," she murmured, as if the name took her back to a distant time. "She was devastated when she left Eloise here. I've never seen a mother so heartbroken," she said, her voice low and filled with sorrow. Those words hit me hard. I started imagining my mother in that very place, holding my sister in her arms, consumed by a profound pain I had never witnessed. Hearing this, part of me wanted to forgive her. But at the same time, knowing she went through this and still hid it from me for so long made resentment mix with guilt. Helen went on describing Olivia's state that day, which only added more layers of sadness to the image of the woman who raised me. However, no matter how much I tried, those words did not bring me any closer to the truth. Helen guided me to a room at the back of the building. The lights flickered, and the furniture, covered in dust, indicated that few had been there recently. "The old records are all here. If there's any clue about your sister, it should be among these documents," she said as she began to open drawers with difficulty. The sound of papers being shuffled was almost deafening in the silence that followed. I stood still for a moment, looking at the piles of old files. My mind was racing. Was I about to discover something concrete about Eloise? A piece of her life that might lead me to her? The emotion mixed with fear, creating an anxiety I didn't know how to control. And then, after a few minutes of searching, Helen pulled a dusty file from the drawer. "Here it is," she said, handing me the document. My hands trembled as I took it. The name Eloise Clark was written at the top of the page, in simple, almost formal handwriting. At that moment, my sister ceased to be just an abstract idea. She was real. Every detail on the paper seemed to bring Eloise closer to me, but at the same time, it pushed her away. The document stated that Eloise had been adopted by a family named Everett. They lived in a small town a few hours away from there. There were no more details other than the name and the date of adoption. No address, no indication of where they went or what happened afterward. Holding that paper, knowing that it represented the last tangible link I had to my sister, made me feel a strange mix of closeness and distance. "Is this all?" I asked, my voice low, almost pleading for more information. Helen shook her head, frustrated. "I'm sorry, Nathan, but this is all we have. Perhaps this family has more information. You will need to go to them." I felt the weight of emptiness. As much as that document brought me something, it still felt insufficient. It was like trying to reach for something that always slipped away at the last moment. I wondered what this family was like, who these people were that raised Eloise, and most importantly, did she know about me? Or was I just a shadow in her life, just as she had been to me? With the name of the Everett family in hand, I drove to the small town mentioned in the old records. The place was as quiet as it seemed on paper. Narrow streets, old houses, and few people around. I felt out of place there, a stranger in search of answers that might not even exist anymore. I followed the address from the old records, but the house where the Everetts had lived was empty, with a "for sale" sign out front. Not knowing what else to do, I asked an elderly woman sitting on the porch of the neighboring house. Perhaps she knew the whereabouts of the family. "The Everetts?" "Yes, they lived here for a while," she said, lighting a cigarette. "I think they moved a few years ago, but I remember well their daughter. Eloise, right? She was a quiet girl, always with a distant look." My breath caught in my chest. I was so close now. "Do you remember anything else about her?" I asked, trying not to sound as desperate as I felt. The woman thought for a moment, slowly exhaling smoke. "There was something sad about her, you know? Like she knew she didn't belong there." Those words pierced my soul. Eloise, my sister, had felt out of place too. Did she spend her whole life feeling like a stranger, just as I felt now? At that moment, I began to imagine Eloise as a lost version of myself, carrying a weight I had never had to bear. And that thought consumed me. The distance between us, built by years of silence and secrets, seemed to grow, even though I was getting closer to her. The feeling that I was about to open a door to a life I had never imagined began to consume me. Eloise was no longer a shadow or a distant memory. She was real as the air I breathed. And I was determined to find her, even if it meant facing the most painful truths about myself and our history. The search for Eloise felt endless. I had already gone through dead ends, talked to people who barely remembered her existence, and revisited every detail that could give me a clue. But nothing had prepared me for what was to come. After weeks of investigation, I finally found her. The house was simple, modest, and the front yard was neglected. It was the kind of place that seemed to scream disconnection, a feeling that mirrored my own search. What would I find there? Anxiety grew within me, and I felt my heart race as I knocked on the door. I knew I was about to meet my twin sister for the first time, but I had no idea what to expect. My hands were sweaty, and I couldn't organize my thoughts. The reality of what was happening felt stranger than any scenario I had imagined. The door opened slowly, creaking as if it hadn't been used much. and there she was, Eloise. The shock was absolute. It was like looking into a mirror that returned a version of myself I didn't know. She was my exact copy. The same height, the same facial features, the same hair. But what struck me most was the cold, distrustful look she shot me. There was something in her eyes that made me feel like I was the intruder, someone breaking an invisible barrier. "Who are you?" she asked, her voice heavy with disbelief. It was the first time I heard her voice, but it wasn't what I expected. There was no warmth, no curiosity, only a chilling suspicion that made me hesitate for a moment. I was left speechless. My mind, which had been so focused on finding her, now seemed incapable of processing what to say. How could I summarize the weight of 34 years of secrets in a single sentence? "I am Nathan," I said, my voice trembling. "Your brother." The discomfort between us was palpable. The air grew heavy, and for a moment, I thought she might close the door in my face. We weren't just strangers. We were twins who had never met, bound by blood, but separated by a lifetime of silence. She let me in, but the tension was unbearable. The house, like the garden, was simple and somewhat empty. The undecorated walls and old furniture seemed to belong to no one, as if they were just there, without history or identity. Eloise sat down across from me, her arms crossed, her eyes watching me with a mix of curiosity and resentment. The discomfort in her body was evident, as if she were ready to kick me out at any moment. I took a deep breath, trying to find the right words, but everything that came out felt forced. "I found you because our mother, Olivia, died. And she told me about you, about what happened." The words slipped out before I could think better of them. The name Olivia seemed to have the opposite effect of what I imagined. What I hoped would be a moment of understanding, a step toward reconciliation, turned into a trigger. "Olivia?" she repeated, visibly growing angry in her eyes. "She abandoned me! How do you expect me to accept this?" The tone of her voice was loud and cutting. Eloise stood up abruptly, her fists clenched. "You come here and expect me to just accept that she's dead? That she told you everything? That suddenly everything is resolved?" I stood up, feeling the ground crumble beneath my feet. I tried to explain, tried to talk about the regret my mother carried, but Eloise was consumed by a rage that left no room for understanding. "She abandoned me!" she shouted again, tears of anger welling in her eyes. "You grew up with her! You had a life while I was left behind. I never knew about you. Never knew I existed." Her words hit me like knives. I didn't know what to say. It was clear that what I saw as a revelation that would bring answers, for her, was just another wound being opened. The tension in the air was suffocating. The blood bond we shared seemed useless in the face of the emotional distance that separated us. The silence that followed her words was deafening. For a moment, I saw Eloise's face soften. The tears continued to flow, but the hatred was still there, mixed with pain. She looked at me, her eyes swollen with rage and sadness, and I knew, in that moment, that there was little I could do to heal that wound. No matter how hard I tried to explain, no matter how much I wanted to connect, the truth was that I hadn't been there when she needed me. And now it seemed too late. "I don't need you," she said, her voice calmer but still laden with resentment. "And I certainly don't need her." The coldness with which she referred to our mother made my stomach churn. Part of me wanted to defend her, wanted to shout that Olivia had suffered just as much as she had. But another part knew that this was a pain I could never fully comprehend. Eloise had her reasons, and I was just the stranger who brought all these painful memories to light. She turned away as if she had already made up her mind. "I lived my whole life without knowing about you. I'm not going to start now." Her words were definitive, unyielding. I tried to speak, but the words just wouldn't come. She opened the door of the house, indicating that I should leave. And in that moment, I knew that what I had dreamed of as an emotional reunion was crumbling before my eyes. As I crossed the threshold, I felt as if I were losing someone once again. Eloise was real. She was right there in front of me, but she felt more distant than ever. I thought finding her would be the beginning of something, but as I left that house, the only thing I felt was emptiness. The same emptiness she had left in my life before I even knew she existed. The sound of the door closing behind me was a final blow. Eloise wanted nothing to do with me. I was alone again, once more losing someone who should have been by my side from the start. After our meeting, something seemed to have broken inside Eloise. I knew that the revelation about Olivia and our family would be devastating for her, but I had no idea how deeply it would impact everything she believed. Back in her life, Eloise isolated herself even more. The resentment she already harbored towards Olivia and me somehow intensified. I could feel it in the distance she imposed, in the silence that dragged between us. Eloise began to live as if she were trapped in her own memories. She relived every moment of her childhood with the Everetts, a family that loved her deeply, but that never seemed to really belong to her. And in her mind, the comparison with what could have been began to poison her thoughts. With every happy memory, a shadow of doubt emerged. They lived happily while I was forgotten. She murmured to herself, each word heavy with resentment. This anger began to grow within her, feeding on the idea that I had somehow lived a perfect life alongside Olivia while she was left behind. It was a distorted perception, I knew that, but I couldn't reach her to explain. For Eloise, everything seemed too clear. She was the rejected one, the forgotten one, while I received all the love she never had. The resentment was like a poison consuming her slowly. With every happy memory of the Everett family, there was a shadow of bitterness, a feeling that everything she lived was tainted by Olivia's rejection. The anger she carried made it impossible for her to find any sense of peace. I knew she was suffering, but I felt powerless before the wall she was erecting between us. As the resentment grew, Eloise sank deeper into the memories of her childhood. She spent hours sitting alone, trying to understand her own story. Every detail that once seemed insignificant now carried a new weight. The moments with the Everetts, which had previously been simple recollections of a tranquil childhood, now became torturous, as if she were reliving a life that was never meant to be hers. She recalled how, since she was little, she always felt out of place. Even with the care and affection of the Everetts, there was a sense that something was wrong, that there was a piece of her history missing. Eloise never managed to understand where that restlessness came from. But now, with the revelation about Olivia and me, everything seemed to make sense. And this new understanding brought no comfort. On the contrary, it was devastating. They chose to leave me, she repeated, her words sharp, as if she were trying to convince herself of that. Images of her childhood flashed before her eyes, the birthdays with the Everetts, the Christmases with family, the moments of affection. Each memory now felt contaminated by the idea that somewhere her true mother and brother lived without her. The abandonment, once wrapped in mystery, was now cruelly clear. Tears of anger streamed down her face as she relived those moments. The feeling of having been rejected by Olivia and the idea that I knew the truth and kept her away consumed her. The pain was unbearable. Eloise felt betrayed by everyone, as if the life she lived was a farce, a lie constructed to hide the pain of rejection. For her, nothing made sense anymore, and the anger only continued to grow. As Eloise sank deeper into her memories and the anger she felt, I couldn't simply let her drift away. With each passing day, the distance between us seemed to increase, but I didn't want to give up. I knew Eloise was hurt, that the revelation about our mother had shattered her, but I was also wounded. I needed her to know that, to understand that I was also a victim of that secret. I sent several messages to Eloise, trying in some way to connect with her. I attempted to explain that, just like her, I had never known about her existence until our mother's final moments. I said that I also felt betrayed, confused, and that I wanted to make things right, that I wanted to get to know her. I was also left in the dark, I wrote. But for Eloise, each message felt like a painful reminder of what she had lost. Every word I sent, no matter how sincere, was received by her as a new stab to the heart. Why does he insist? ***, she wondered. I don't want to know. ***. And despite her harsh words, there was a part of her that desperately wanted to know me. The problem was that the resentment still spoke louder. Eloise didn't know how to cope with the possibility of opening her heart to someone who, until recently, didn't exist in her life. I was a stranger, and even being her blood brother, our connection still felt distant and unreal. Days passed, and I kept trying, hoping that eventually Eloise would be willing to listen to me. I wanted more than anything for her to understand that I wasn't to blame for what happened, that I was on the same side, trying to deal with the truth that had been taken from us for so long. But at that moment, her resentment was still too strong, an insurmountable barrier that I didn't know how to cross. With each ignored message, each prolonged silence, I wondered if we would ever be able to overcome this. But even in the face of all the obstacles, I knew I couldn't give up. She was my sister, and I was determined not to leave her behind, no matter how difficult it was. After our disastrous meeting and the unsuccessful attempts to reach out, Eloise pulled away. I couldn't shake the way she had rejected me with a coldness I had never imagined. I felt that somehow there was no longer any room to try to reconnect with her. But there was still a piece of this puzzle that I couldn't ignore. Our father, Robert. The idea of seeking out Robert frightened me. I grew up without a father figure, and although my mother had filled that absence, I always felt the lack of that side of my life. Now, with Eloise knowing the truth, and I carrying the weight of Olivia's regrets, all that was left was to understand Robert's role in all of this. What did he know? Why did he never do anything? The questions were countless, and I knew I couldn't continue without getting answers. It took time, but I managed to find Robert's whereabouts. He lived in a small town in the countryside, far from everything and everyone, as if he had chosen to hide from life. When I arrived at the address, I faced an old, worn-out house, almost as if it reflected the very soul of the man who lived there. My heart raced as I walked up to the door. I didn't know what to expect, but I knew it was necessary. I knocked several times before the door opened. A man with an aged appearance, shoulders hunched as if carrying the weight of an invisible burden, appeared. He looked at me with eyes that had seen too much, and for a moment, I wondered if he knew who I was. "Robert?" I asked, my voice hesitant. He nodded, confused. "Yes. Who are you?" There was a pause while he examined me. I took a deep breath, trying to stay calm. "I'm Nathan, Olivia's son." The name of my mother seemed to bring a storm of emotions to Robert's face. He looked away, clearly shaken. "Come in," he murmured, stepping aside to let me pass. The house was dark and disorganized, as if time had stopped there. We sat in the living room, and the silence between us was almost palpable. Finally, I broke the ice. "I came because I need to understand. About Eloise, and about you. Why did you never do anything? Why did you never look for her? For us?" Robert sighed, his eyes lost in some distant point. "I knew about Eloise," he admitted, his voice almost a whisper. "I knew that Olivia gave her up, but I was too cowardly. I failed, Nathan. I was a coward." His words fell heavily. He didn't try to justify himself, didn't ask for forgiveness, just admitted his mistake in a raw way. That hit me hard. Part of me hoped he would have a reason, a redemptive explanation, something that would somehow lessen the pain of Eloise's abandonment. But there was none of that. Just guilt, regret, and a lifetime of omissions. I looked at him, seeing the man destroyed by the guilt he carried. "I failed you. I failed her, failed Olivia, and failed you." That meeting destroyed any hope I still had of finding a justification for what happened. Robert wasn't the villain I had imagined, but he also wasn't a hero who could fix the past. He was just a man, broken, lost in his own cowardice. I left the house with a weight on my chest. There weren't enough answers that could erase what Eloise had gone through, and I knew I needed to tell her. The days that followed my meeting with Robert were the hardest. No matter how hard I tried, I couldn't stop thinking about Eloise. She needed to know the truth. No matter how painful it was, she deserved to hear what Robert had told me. But at the same time, the fear of her reaction paralyzed me. I had already been rejected once. Would I be able to face that again? After much hesitation, I decided to send her a message. The words came out hesitantly, as if each one carried the weight of years of secrets and sorrows. Eloise, I found our father. He admitted everything, and I think you need to hear what he has to say. We need to talk. I hit send and waited, my heart pounding in my chest. Time seemed to drag as I awaited a response. My hands were sweaty, and anxiety grew with each passing minute. Deep down, I didn't know if she would even reply, much less if she would accept what I had to say. But surprisingly, a response came. I'll go, not for you, but for me. I need answers. That message was both a relief and a burden. I knew that Eloise wasn't ready to forgive me or understand what had happened, but she was willing to listen, and that was already a step forward. I scheduled the meeting at a cafe near the town where Robert lived, and I felt my body filled with a mix of nervousness and hope. I wanted that meeting to be a step toward reconciliation, but I knew there was more at stake. Eloise wasn't coming to connect with me. She wanted to confront the truths that haunted her. And deep down, I understood that. The cafe where we arranged to meet was a simple place, with a few tables and an air of calmness. I arrived early, anxious, trying to mentally prepare for what was to come. I sat by the window watching people pass by as my mind revisited every detail of what Robert had told me. When Eloise arrived, the discomfort between us was palpable. I stood up to greet her, but she merely nodded, with no intention of physical contact. What struck me the most, however, was the expression on her face. Eloise was different. She no longer seemed like the woman filled with fury who confronted me last time. There was something deeper in her eyes, a mix of pain and determination. We sat across from each other, and the silence that settled between us was heavy. Even there, sitting so close, we were strangers. Blood of the same blood, yet still distant as if we lived on different planets. She finally broke the silence, her tone direct. What did he say? I explained what had happened during my meeting with Robert, every detail of how he admitted his guilt, his failure to be a father. The words came out of me mechanically, as if I were reading a script I didn't want to follow. But I knew Eloise needed to hear. She needed to face that, just as I had. As I spoke, I noticed subtle changes in her face. She tried to maintain her composure, but it was clear that what I was saying affected her. She listened to every word intently, yet at the same time, it seemed she was keeping a barrier, as if protecting the last part of herself that hadn't been broken yet. In the end, when I finished recounting everything, silence returned between us. Eloise looked at me, saying nothing for a long time. Finally, she sighed. I need to see him, she said, her voice lower, almost a whisper. She was willing to confront the ghost of the past. Eloise and I walked in heavy silence toward Robert's house. Each step felt like it carried an invisible weight, as if we were walking toward the center of an emotional hurricane. I could feel the tension in the air, especially beside me, where Eloise walked with her eyes fixed on the horizon, not saying a word. She had agreed to meet Robert, but I knew that her anger simmered beneath her calm facade. She was about to confront the man who, in her mind, could have prevented all the suffering she had endured. When we finally arrived, the same worn and forgotten house welcomed us. The discomfort in the atmosphere was almost palpable, as if the environment absorbed and amplified the emotions of those who entered. I knocked on the door and waited, unsure of what exactly to expect from this meeting. Robert opened the door with the same expression of guilt I had seen before. His tired eyes quickly recognized Eloise's face, and something shifted in his posture. He looked even more hunched, even older. The silence between us stretched for an eternity until Eloise took a step forward. "You knew, and did nothing." Her voice was low but filled with contained fury. Robert met her gaze for a brief moment before looking away, unable to bear the weight of the guilt he carried. He started, his voice trembling. "I was weak. I couldn't face the situation. I failed you. Failed all of you." The words came out in a stutter, tears already forming in his eyes. It was the confession I had expected. But Eloise, hearing it for the first time, didn't seem relieved at all. Her eyes remained fixed on Robert, as if she were trying to see beyond the words, beyond the fragility of a man who now seemed more a shadow than a father figure. She crossed her arms, her breathing becoming heavier. I knew that this was the calm before the storm. The confrontation that was about to unfold would be painful but unavoidable. "Failed?" Eloise repeated, her voice rising in intensity. She took another step forward, her fists clenched. "You abandoned me. You knew where I was, knew what was happening, and did nothing." The words exploded from within her, and all the resentment she had accumulated over her life manifested at once. "I grew up feeling lost, abandoned, not knowing where I came from, who I really was. And you simply did nothing." What happened next was like a dam bursting. Eloise began to scream, her emotions overflowing uncontrollably. "You don't know what it's like to grow up not knowing why you were left behind. I spent my whole life feeling unwanted, like something was missing, like I was insufficient." With each word, the pain and bitterness she had harbored inside her came to the surface, like a volcano that had been dormant for too long. Robert, for his part, could barely keep his head up. He simply listened, absorbing Eloise's screams, his shoulders hunched, as if each of her words crushed him a little more. I watched the scene, completely powerless, feeling the intensity of everything that was happening, but knowing that this confrontation was necessary for Eloise to begin processing all the pain she carried. "You should have been my father!" she shouted, tears streaming down her face, her voice now hoarse from screaming. "You should have done something, anything, but you just forgot me." At that moment, I realized there was nothing I could say to fix this. Eloise's words were raw, open wounds that needed to be exposed so she could one day begin to heal. And Robert, he was the inevitable target of all this pain. It was hard to watch, but perhaps it was the only way for Eloise to deal with the years of abandonment and hurt. After minutes of shouting and tears, Eloise finally collapsed. Her body, once rigid and filled with rage, seemed to lose all energy at once. She sat on the floor, exhausted, her face stained with tears. The sobs coming from her were almost silent, but the intensity of the moment still dominated the room. Robert somehow managed to approach. He slowly knelt down in front of her without saying a word. For the first time, I saw Robert truly confront what he had done, or failed to do. His hands trembled, and I could see the effort he made to get closer, knowing that his words might not have the power to heal what was broken, but trying nonetheless. "Eloise," he began, his voice choked. "I don't deserve your forgiveness. I know that. I failed you in ways that can never be undone. But I always loved you. Always." Those words hung in the air, and for a moment, Eloise stopped crying. She looked at Robert, surprised, as if she didn't know how to react. The man she hated, who symbolized all the abandonment and suffering in her life, was now confessing a love she had never felt. I didn't know what Eloise would do, and I also didn't know how to process it. My own relationship with Robert was practically non-existent, but witnessing this moment, seeing the man before me admit his guilt so vulnerably, was hard to ignore. I felt torn between compassion and anger, between the desire to forgive and the need to confront the mistakes he had made. Eloise remained silent for a long time, her face still stained with tears. Robert extended his hand, hesitant, but did not touch her. I never knew how to correct my mistakes, but I want you to know that I loved you from the very first day. I just didn't know how to be the father you deserved. Eloise took a deep breath, wiping her face with the back of her hands. She didn't say anything, but she also didn't push Robert away. What I saw in her eyes was not complete forgiveness, but a small opening. Like the wall of anger and resentment she had built was beginning to crack, even if just a little. I don't know if I'll ever forgive you, she murmured, her voice weak but firm. But maybe anger isn't enough anymore. And with those words, Eloise stood up. She was still hurting, but something had changed. She wasn't ready for forgiveness, but she was beginning to understand that anger couldn't be her only response. We left Robert's house together, the silence between us no longer as heavy as before. There was a new understanding between us, a first step toward healing, no matter how long that road might be. After the confrontation with Robert, silence dominated the way back. Eloise seemed like an extinguished volcano. The fury she had unleashed, the pain that had finally overflowed, all now settled inside her in a way I still couldn't decipher. I left her at the door of her house, and for a moment, I thought about saying something, but her distant gaze made it clear that what she needed at that moment was space. So I simply waved, and she entered without saying a word. The days that followed were filled with uncertainty for me. I knew Eloise was dealing with a pain that had been accumulating for years, and that the encounter with Robert had, in a way, shaken the structure she had built around herself. I could feel the weight she carried, even from a distance. She shut herself in at home, avoiding any interaction. A few times I tried to call, but I never received a response. My heart tightened just at the thought of what she might be going through. Eloise was emotionally exhausted. That was evident. The explosion I witnessed during the confrontation with our father was just a glimpse of the internal storm she was facing now. I knew that, deep down, part of her felt lighter, as if the weight of so many years of hurt had been lifted, even if just a little. But the fear was still there. I knew. The fear of reconnecting, the fear of accepting the past, of dealing with everything our history had brought. Eloise struggled with trust, and I understood why. Throughout her life, trust had been betrayed by those who were supposed to protect her. It was natural for her to hide behind a barrier of distrust and hurt. Sometimes I imagined what it would be like for her to try to reconnect with me. We were twins, blood of the same blood, but our history had turned us into complete strangers. I knew Eloise feared getting close to me just as much as I feared getting close to her. It was as if we walked around an abyss, both aware that we could fall, but not knowing how to build the bridge necessary to meet each other in the middle. One afternoon, days after the confrontation, Eloise picked up the letter that Olivia had left for her. That letter had been in her hands for weeks, carefully folded, stored in a drawer that was rarely opened. Eloise had avoided reading it for fear of what she would find in the words of a mother she had never truly known. A mother who had abandoned her. But at that moment, with her mind exhausted and her heart heavy, Eloise decided it was time to face Olivia's words. She sat at the kitchen table amidst absolute silence. The light streaming through the window was soft, and the world outside seemed distant. Her trembling hand slowly opened the envelope, and the sound of the paper unfolding echoed in the empty house. The first line made her stop. Eloise, my daughter. Asterisk, asterisk. There was something strange about that phrase. Eloise had never felt like Olivia's daughter. She had never had the chance to be. Yet there it was, handwritten, a connection she had always denied. The following words were a painful confession. Olivia held nothing back about the weight she had carried since the day she gave Eloise up for adoption. She wrote about the internal struggle, the regret, and how, over the years, she had tried to convince herself that she had made the right choice. But deep down, she knew she had failed. I loved you from the moment I saw you, and loving you was the hardest thing I ever did. Asterisk, asterisk. These words echoed in Eloise's mind, and she felt something inside her begin to break. The shield she had built to protect herself from pain and abandonment started to crack. Olivia also described how she had kept this secret from Nathan for fear of losing the only child she had left. Olivia's pain was clear in every line. "I don't expect your forgiveness, Eloise. I don't deserve it, but I wanted you to know that, even from afar, I always loved you." Asterisk, asterisk, asterisk. Reading the letter was devastating. Eloise cried. Each word of regret and love seemed to dissolve another layer of the wall she had built over the years. For the first time, she allowed herself to feel the loss of Olivia not as a betrayal, but as the weight of a decision that marked both of them forever. Olivia's love, embedded in every line of that letter, was the push Eloise needed. It wasn't immediate forgiveness, but a step towards something she had never considered possible: healing. After reading the letter and spending days reflecting on everything that had happened, Eloise felt different. The pain was still there, the resentment too, but something had changed. There was a lightness she couldn't explain. Perhaps it was the fact that she had faced Robert, or perhaps it was Olivia's words, so laden with guilt and love. She knew that the journey to forgiveness would be long and tortuous, but for the first time in a long time, Eloise felt she could try. It wasn't certainty, but it was the beginning of something. And more importantly, she knew she couldn't move forward without trying to reconnect with Nathan. He was part of this story, just as much as she was. Eloise picked up the phone, hesitating, and looked at the screen for long minutes before finally starting to type. The words were simple, direct. "We need to talk." Asterisk, asterisk. She hesitated once more before hitting send, but as she did, she felt a sense of relief. It was a small step, but it was the first. On my side, when I received that message, I felt a wave of emotions hit me all at once. I had waited so long for this that for a moment, I doubted it was real. We need to talk. Those 3 words, so simple, carried a tremendous weight. They were a ray of hope amid the chaos that had settled between us since our first encounter. Eloise was finally ready to speak, to face whatever remained between us. Perhaps it wasn't the moment to resolve everything, but now, there was a chance. A chance to finally begin to understand what it meant to be twins, siblings separated by life, but perhaps still capable of finding some kind of connection. I responded to Eloise's message with a suggestion to meet, my heart racing, filled with expectation. I knew things wouldn't be easy, but for the first time I felt we were both willing to take the first step towards something new. The cafe where we agreed to meet was the same as before. When I walked in, the familiar smell of freshly brewed coffee brought back memories of our first meeting, a moment filled with discomfort and unspoken hurts. Nervousness haunted me once again. I didn't know what to expect this time, but I felt something had changed. Eloise was now willing to talk, to open a small space for us to understand each other. Still, the fear of another rejection lingered over me. I saw Eloise sitting at a table near the window, gazing outside, lost in thought. She seemed calmer now, but there was still a shadow in her eyes. As I approached, she noticed me and gave a shy smile. I sat down in front of her, and for a moment, silence reigned between us. But this time, it wasn't the uncomfortable silence of before. It was a silence that seemed to give us the time we needed to breathe and prepare for what was to come. Finally, Eloise broke the silence. Her eyes were misty, and she seemed to be struggling to find the right words. "I never imagined I could hate you so much without even knowing you," she confessed, her voice choked. "But now, all I want is to understand." These words struck me deeply. All the resentment, all the pain that Eloise carried was not directed at me, but at the situation. It was a hatred fueled by emptiness, by the unknown. Tears welled up in my eyes, and I could barely hold back my emotions. "I just want to be your brother," I replied, my voice low and trembling. There was nothing more I could say at that moment. The strangeness that enveloped us seemed to slowly start to dissipate. Eloise looked at me, no longer with distrust, but with genuine curiosity. We began to talk, little by little, sharing stories, exchanging fragments of the lives we lived apart. She told me about the life she had with the Everetts, her adoptive parents. They gave me everything. They were good to me, loved me. But I always knew I didn't belong there. It was a feeling that never went away, she said, looking at the coffee on the table, avoiding my gaze. The Everetts had already passed away, and Eloise seemed to carry the pain of loss, but also an emptiness that had never been filled. Even with all the love they gave me, I always felt incomplete. I listened attentively, each of her words revealing a little more about who Eloise was, about the pain she had carried alone for so long. And by sharing her story, I felt she was also beginning to understand mine. The chasm between us, created by distance, secrets, and absence, was starting to shrink. For the first time, I saw Eloise as more than a lost sister. I saw in her a person with wounds as deep as mine. The conversation flowed more smoothly now, but there was still something unspoken, something that Eloise seemed to hold inside, as if it were difficult to put into words. Finally, after a long and heavy pause, she sighed and looked directly at me, her eyes filled with a mix of pain and relief. I spent my whole life feeling lost, Nathan. Not just for not knowing about you, but for not knowing where I came from, for not understanding why I was left behind. I always had loving parents, but the hole that was left never filled. I felt out of place, as if something was always missing. Her words echoed inside me. I could feel the weight of each one. Eloise was exposing herself, revealing the most vulnerable part of her soul. I don't know if I'll ever be able to fully forgive, but I want to try. I want to know you. I want to understand our mother. She said this with such sincerity that I could no longer hold back my tears. What Eloise was offering me there was a chance, a thread of hope for building something that neither of us knew very well how to handle. I reached out my hand to her, and for the first time, Eloise accepted my touch. When our hands met, there was a connection that, until that moment, had only existed on paper, in blood. Now, there was finally something real between us. We sat there for a few minutes, in silence, just holding hands. It was a simple gesture, but it was loaded with meaning. Eloise and I, after being separated for so long by a wall of secrets and hurts, were beginning to reconnect. It wouldn't be easy. We knew that. But we were willing to try. A few months later, the anniversary of Olivia's death arrived. I knew this day would be difficult for me, but I was even more apprehensive about the impact it would have on Eloise. She was still struggling with her feelings regarding our mother, and I wasn't sure how she would cope with forgiveness. I invited Eloise to go with me to the cemetery. She hesitated, but eventually accepted. We knew we needed to close that chapter in some way. When we arrived, the wind was blowing gently, and the sound of the leaves rustling in the trees around us seemed to be the only thing filling the silence between us. Olivia's grave was simple, adorned with flowers I'd left there a few days earlier. Eloise looked at the tombstone for a long time, without saying anything. I knew she was struggling internally, trying to find the words, trying to understand how she could forgive someone who, in her eyes, had caused so much suffering. Finally, she took the letter out of her pocket. The letter she had read and which, in some way, had begun to change her perspective. Holding the paper in her hands, Eloise whispered, her voice trembling, "I forgive you, Mom." It was a silent moment, but filled with meaning. I moved closer and wrapped my arm around her. Tears streamed down Eloise's face, and I felt my own falling as we stood there together, before Olivia's grave. Forgiveness was not a period, but a beginning. We knew the path to healing would be long, but we were ready to move forward, together as siblings. It was the beginning of a new story. The story of two siblings who, despite all the adversities, were finally ready to find the peace and connection they had long sought. The day was clear, with a bright blue sky and the soft light of the late afternoon sun. Eloise and I stood in the backyard of our mother's house, the place where so many of my memories, both good and painful, had accumulated over the years. Before us, the hole we had dug in the ground seemed to represent much more than the simple act of planting a tree. It was a symbol of a new beginning, of a shared life we were willing to build together, despite everything. The sapling we were planting was small, fragile, and would require care and patience, just like the relationship we were beginning to rebuild. With our hands dirty from the soil, Eloise looked at me and smiled. It was a shy yet sincere smile, the kind of smile I had always imagined seeing on her face, but that had seemed impossible before. Now, there was finally hope. "This is for us," she said, placing the last handful of soil over the roots of the tree. "For what we were and for what we can be." Her words echoed in my mind. It was incredible to think about how we had come to this point. Eloise, who had once rejected me so vehemently, was now by my side, ready to move forward. As I covered the roots with soil, I felt that we were burying, along with them, the remnants of the past, all the pain, the secrets, the wounds. The simple act of planting that tree marked a new beginning, not only for us, but for everything we wanted to build from that moment on. When we finished, we stepped back to admire the tree, so small still, but with the potential to grow. Eloise looked at me again, this time with more confidence. "This tree will grow with us," she said, and I knew she was right. What we had started in that moment was not just a symbol, it was a promise. After planting the tree, we sat in the backyard under the shade cast by the house. The sunlight filtered through the older trees, creating patterns of light and shadow on the ground around us. There was a sense of peace in that place, a tranquility I hadn't experienced in a long time. Eloise was beside me, more relaxed than ever. It was the first time we felt that calm together. The absence of secrets between us had left space for something new, a silent yet constant hope. The chasm that once separated us was slowly closing, and now we were able to look toward the future without the weight of the past dragging us back. Eloise, who had previously worn a hard and distant expression, now gazed at the horizon with a serenity I had never seen before. "Now we're going to be a real family," I said, my voice carrying more than just a simple affirmation. It was a commitment. For so long, I had wished for Eloise to be part of my life, and now that was finally happening. She turned to me, her eyes shining with something I hadn't seen since the start of our journey together. "Yes, a real family," she replied, with a small smile. It wasn't just an acceptance of the present, but a decision to leave the past behind and build something new. The journey to that moment had been long and painful, marked by confrontations, tears, and discoveries that changed who we were. But at that moment, everything seemed to align for something greater, something that was just beginning. Life wouldn't be perfect, we knew that. There would be challenges and difficult moments, but we were ready to face them together. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. And I knew, in some way, Eloise felt the same. Years passed since that day, and the tree we planted in the backyard of our mother's house now stood tall and strong. Eloise and I always returned to this house, which had become a refuge for us. It was not just the place where our lives had begun, but a meeting point, a sanctuary where, from time to time, we came with our families to rest and find peace. Olivia's house, once marked by so many secrets and sorrows, had now become a place of healing. The bond between Eloise and me had grown over the years, just like that tree. Each of us followed our own journey, formed our own families, but we always made time to reconnect here. My children ran through the yard, playing with Eloise's children. It was surreal to think that after everything, we had made it. What once seemed impossible, being a real family, was now our reality. Eloise was by my side as we watched the children play under the shade of the tree. I looked at her, and the serene expression on her face told me everything I needed to know. She was at peace, something I never thought I would see when we first met. The path to that moment had been long, full of stumbles, but the important thing was that together we had made it. Inside the house, in the living room, there was a portrait of Olivia hanging on the wall. Eloise and I approached it in silence. The image of our mother looked at us with a tranquility I had only recently begun to understand. "We fixed this, Mom," Eloise murmured, her eyes shining with an emotion she tried to contain. I placed my hand on her shoulder, feeling the same gratitude she did. It wasn't easy to forgive. It wasn't easy to move forward, but we had done it. The tree in the yard, now full of life, was a symbol not only of our restart, but of the second chance our mother had given us, even without being present to see the outcome. I looked at the portrait and whispered silently, "Thank you, Mom." There were no more wounds, no secrets, just gratitude for having found each other. What Olivia started, we had finished. Now we were a family, connected not only by blood, but by the choice to move forward together.
In the end, Nathan and Eloise not only uncovered the truth about their past, but also found a new chance to become a family. The forgiveness Eloise offered Olivia and the bond she built with Nathan proved that no matter how deep the wounds, there is always room for healing. Life teaches us that love, even imperfect, can bloom from the most painful experiences. And you, how far would you go to rebuild a lost family relationship? If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, hit the notification bell, and leave your like. Comment below your thoughts on Nathan and Eloise's journey, and don't forget to click on the end screen card to watch the next recommended video. Thank you so much for watching, and see you next time.